Archie Sonic the Hedgehog. Where does one even begin in discussing this behemoth? It's a common story, but my initial encounter with these comics comes from a lot of time spent looking at the covers in Mega Collection Plus's extra menu, dreaming of what madness could possibly be behind those crazy artworks. Given that Sonic has been my favourite media franchise for literally as far as my memory stretches, this has always kept the comics at the edge of my mind. Admittedly, it took a long time before I would actually read them, since for a long time I had no way to find it. I would often go to comic shops with my brother but had no luck, and so would mostly watch a few scattered stories here and there in the videos that people upload to YouTube, and was enamored by Mr. Recolor Man Scourge and his evil superform. But it was only in the debut of the episodic Sonic Universe series that I would say I hopped on, though again, without a way to access any of the backlog. After orbiting the series with random issues and osmotic knowledge for all my life, and after several attempts to tackle it that never made it beyond the initial slapstick era, the 30th anniversary celebrations kind of, put me in a Sonic mood, and I figured it was finally time to sit down and do a full, comprehensive read of the Archie published Sonic the Hedgehog comic series. Such a wild journey this is. It was a downright struggle to get through its early years, and despite almost immediately finding the lore intriguing, I don't think I had ever actually thought to myself that it was enjoyable as anything more than an observational experiment until the tail end of the adventure adaptation with Silver Sonic 2, which is quite a long time, by the way. That's at issue 80, and you might be thinking, dang man, 80 issues is a long time to be forcing yourself to read something. But no. It's not that generous. The Sonic comics are densely packed and constantly weaving in and out of various sub-series. Number 80 is actually around 150 issues into the reading order, and that is a long time to be putting up with something where my primary reaction was, in 200 chapters this plot thread is going to be so awesome. It was very much a labour of love, but it's certainly been a worthwhile read to get here. This story and setting are some of the most captivating in an already captivating franchise. Its cast is convoluted, and with the whole series in view, the only consistency to be found is in how inconsistent it all is. It's an extremely fascinating universe of excessive character definition. It is a mess, eventually made magic. As a lifelong franchise fan, and someone who had been curious about these comics in some form or another all that time, it's unbelievably rewarding to finally go back to it. Rewarding, but that doesn't automatically equal a good time, because for a huge chunk of its run, the comic is an absolute slog. The writing can be pretty atrocious in the early half, and a lot of the art is straight up gross to look at, making the promise of eventual gold seem so distant. The leap in quality at number 160 when Flynn and Yardley are swapped in is radical and immediate. Would I recommend reading Archie Sonic? Yes, but it's not an easy sell. It's not like the IDW comic where you can pick it up, immediately understand the context, and have a good time with its bubbly characters and great art. Archie Sonic is a challenge. Heck, even just reading it is an ordeal in and of itself, since it's something where you need an actual supplementary guide to navigate its scattered storyline, and those 480 or so issues of the comic are long since out of print. Right from the decision to read it, you have to wrestle with this comic, and that bout will last for a long time before you start to see it give way, because everything about the early comic will be punching right back at you. It is rough at the start. But if you're a serious fan of the franchise, or particularly experimental media, it's very good. It is absolutely not perfect. Not even in Flynn's run. This comic is fraught with problems. The only all-encompassing descriptor one dare apply to it is problematic. But it is by far the most fleshed out you will ever see its world. The comparatively absurd length of this thing turns it into the weightiest depiction of Sonic & Co. ever. Eventually, everything snaps into place, but it takes the long way in order to arrive there. The Archie published Sonic comics began all the way back in 1992, only a year after the initial game. To really put that into perspective, this comic first released the day after Sonic 2 did, and very nearly missed out on making it all the way to Sonic Forces. It released in a time that we refer to as early Sonic canon, where the series had not yet been given any consistent direction. Amongst drastically different interpretations such as Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog or the Sonic OVA is where Archie Sonic first finds itself. The difference you'll find between all of these is that most of them were short-lived. Archie Sonic, however, was anything but. That legacy it has as the longest-running franchise-based comic isn't just for show. It began so early into the series' life and ran for 24 years before finally being cancelled, with only one reboot along the way. There are multiple distinct stylistic eras and major arcs dividing the story, but it is still one narrative continuously building for decades. What that means for the comic is that by the time Sega had finally decided on a proper image for their mascot and begun unifying all character depictions and setting variants to be consistent with one another, Archie's comic was already too far gone. There was no way it could have been swerved back in line with the main series. This is what makes Archie Sonic so good and so bad. It was totally unhinged. There really were no limits to this thing. Not even its connection to a children's video game series ever seemed to constrain it. Why is Knuckles not the last Echidna, but instead the messiah for a whole cyber civilization? Why is he a Chaos God? Why did they never see the need to actually give Shadow any substantial introduction? He's traditionally the most complex and convoluted character in the cast, so one would expect a series like Archie Sonic to really dive into him. But nah, he just shows up like 180 issues into the reading order, and everyone pretends they already met him off screen in Sonic Adventure 2. Why on earth does Sonic have 16 girlfriends or something? Like, man, people rag on the Sega mandates for the IDW comic, but buried beneath all the needless rules, I will admit that I'm glad they've said romance can't take place in it. It's always been out of place in this franchise, and honestly, it's the biggest roadblock I have recommending this comic in good faith. Why will they not stop drawing these disgusting fur monsters kissing each other? Ken, I don't like it. Please stop. Why oh why did someone think Jeffrey St. John was a character that needed to exist? He is painful to read and centrally embodies everything that is wrong with this comic. Why did it take them 10 years to finally hire someone who knows how to draw Sonic? Why is Bunny drawn like that? Why does Bunny keep being drawn like that? Please stop drawing Bunny like that. Why does a Sonic the Hedgehog comic book show children getting murdered as part of a war conspiracy? Why are there multiple plotlines about domestic violence in a Sonic comic? Why did they think that the most coherent way of getting Robotnik to change his clothes was to kill the original and then replace him with a second robotic version from an alternate universe? Who knows? Archie Sonic is just weird like that. Unlike Sonic X or Sonic Boom, which are spin-offs for the established conventions of the series, the sheer scale of Archie Sonic means that it's best understood as a second franchise, one that doesn't always resemble the first. In fact, in a lot of ways, I think that one would be better served to compare it to Adventure Time before any Sonic game. Experimental and psychedelic, even down to sharing its origin story of nuclear apocalypse. I actually do think it becomes a lot easier to stomach if you mentally approach its oddities from the same angle you would Adventure Time. It's such an abstract piece of media. To see the history it had spent so long cultivating, then wiped out in the Super Genesis wave is troubling. The story is at the scale that when you watch it happen, yeah, it's genuinely painful. In the end, Eggman wins this timeline. Having finally come to realize that the Hedgehog is a factor that simply can't be accounted for, he moves to eliminate the problem at its source. Sonic shouldn't be treated as a mortal conquest, but a logic puzzle that completely defies understanding. He is the chaos in the equation that destiny itself seems to favor, perhaps a long-standing blessing from the late ancient walkers. So the only way to overcome him is to respond in kind. Coming off of a growing frustration and a brief stint of insanity, The madman has opened his eyes to the truth. Eggman cannot win. He literally can't. There is some cosmic equalizer or grand narrative rule at play across the entire multiverse of zones, that no matter the circumstance, no matter the situation, Dr. Robotnik will be made to lose to Sonic the Hedgehog. But of course, he is not going to just take that lying down, so any counterplay requires thinking outside the box. The only way he will ever have a chance at realizing his ambitions is to reach behind the curtains and rewrite that rule. No amount of military force or industrial might will be able to make up the severe divide between them. He will have to bend and break reality in order to arrive at what he believes will finally be checkmate. Between the freedom fighters, the chaotics, and the plentiful political factions, the planet Mobius is certainly not lacking in heavy hitters. But every other force in the world is simply powerless before the Genesis. Calamity is realized at last. They can do nothing but kneel as the deranged dictator of the Eggman Empire finally resorts to destroying everything. When it comes to storytelling, the Archie Sonic comics are something constantly expanding upon itself. The main focus of this comic is less on its overarching story, but about giving an increasing amount of context to the history and geopolitics of its citizenship. The world feels lived in and its people alive. They seem to foremost want that the reader can be able to appropriately situate themselves within it. All narrative development spreads outward more than it does forward. It starts out as a simple gag series about Sonic and the gang kicking some Robotnik and laughing all the way. But by the end there, it's a very dense story with a massive amount of lore and legacy. Characters introduced early into the comic's life will still be actively relevant decades later, to the point that one of the main criticisms leveraged against pre-boot Archie Sonic was that it was positively cramped. The cast was far more bloated than the video game side of the franchise had already been under fire for, and a lot of them were written in such a way that you wouldn't really be able to appreciate them unless you went back and read hundreds of issues to get their full backgrounds. These comics are hard to break into. With its difficult way of telling a story, there are so many characters that get used in important ways. The Sonic the Hedgehog complete comic encyclopedia that attempts to chronicle every single character, organization, and event in the storyline is 191 pages long, separated into 17 different categories. It's great. The comic reaches the point where you seriously cannot seem to go more than 2 pages without seeing footnotes pointing back to stories from the past. Legitimately, every little thing is important. Every small interaction or throwaway event will most likely be dug up again later. You can count on that. So when Eggman initiates the Super Genesis wave and sets that timeline ablaze, you have to understand that it is a big deal. It's an event of actual consequence, lots of it even. When you think about the true scale of the narrative wipe, how many beloved characters have been carelessly eliminated? How many battles have been undone? It's a bit insane. It's brutal. Ultimately, I do think capping off this epic with such an unceremonious end is awe-inspiring and terrifying. This is such a mad comic, cut down in the most mad way. But it's just, yeah, it's crazy to watch unfold. The fact that they didn't just do a clean sweep, but instead worked this in as an in-universe apocalypse, honestly makes this one of the most powerful, most emotional things I've ever seen a story do. Issue 252 hits in 2013, so you're looking at 21 years and roughly 400 chapters of world building that has just been knocked down. These are comics too, so it's not like the minimal scripts in the games. That's hundreds of issues where the main content is the dialogue. You know what the comic is most famous for? All that messy and overly detailed, yet ultimately fascinating echidna mythology. Albion, the Brotherhood of Guardians, the Dark Legion, and the like. The words are unwritten before your very eyes. Like, don't get me wrong, I disavow Penders as much as the next guy for his seemingly predatory lawsuit causing the death of this entire universe, and very likely neutering the storytelling potential of the franchise at large going forward. But with the art separated from the artist, his Echidnopolis pet project was something that I found fairly intriguing, as long as you just kind of push all the youth drama out of your mind. And I think it's one of the most potent examples to point to in order to showcase the magnitude of what has just transpired. Imagine the Marvel Cinematic Universe, except twice as old, say 5 times as many characters and 10 times as many stories. What if when Thanos snapped 70% of the cast out of existence, they stayed erased? That kinda clues you into what the Genesis wave has wrought. Probably. Actually, I haven't watched a Marvel movie since the first Avengers and don't really have any interest in watching more, but I think my allegory of the snap is perhaps, probably, sort of, maybe correct. A very substantial history is purged. Scourge? Never happened. The Destructics? Gone. The ambiguous pursuit of democracy when the recovered King Maximilian turns out to be almost as much of a warlord as Robotnik. That entire drama is erased and he's replaced by a generic good king. Max was quite interesting for being one of the most flawed characters on the Mobian side. He's just a bad father, constantly trying to restrict his daughter's freedoms because royalty and societal obligation has somewhat robbed him of his ability to empathize. Max is the product of an old regime. He's a monster in an outdated machine. Max is then responsible for one of the most important moments in the entire storyline to me. That bit near the end where Norgus tries to manipulate him into becoming his new vessel. By this point, he was little more than a decrepit old man, his mind half gone and his body barely functioning. But he still summons the will to reject the wizard's advances, and then thanks his wife for standing up for him. You have literally watched this man across multiple years as his bad attitude tears his family apart, and his failing health slowly drags him toward ruin. But then there's just this singular positive moment for him at the end of it all. It feels like watching someone with Alzheimer's briefly become cognizant. I don't care who knows, that damn near made me cry. And that's to say nothing of the upcoming plotlines that were tragically cut short, especially in the current era of the Phantom Ruby and Warp Topaz. That we never got to fully explore the mystery of the ancient onyx stings quite a bit. We really only see it twice, but that first time it was significant enough to take place of the Master Emerald in the adventure adaptation, and that's why I am so curious where Ian Flynn was going to take that. It's one of the oldest artifacts in the story, and throughout his run it came across that Flynn seemed to be just as much of a fan and lore buff of this comic as the readers were. Probably more, if I'm being honest. In the end of its arc, Sonic mentions that whatever it is, it sure as heck ain't a Chaos Emerald. And that's actually a massive deal considering the Chaos Force is the backbone for pretty much everything else in the narrative. It was malign and enigmatic, and in that last shot of it, we can spot hellfire raging within. I'm sad that never got the chance to develop, because I'm sure it would have made for some of the best arcs in the story. The Genesis wave hits at a very inconvenient place in Sonic Universe too. In some regards, it's ironic to like Scourge so much since his entire story really is about his inability to be as cool as Sonic. He's kinda like Snively in that regard, where for most of his existence he's actually just a punchline. Evil Sonic exists to be humiliated by Sonic. But nevertheless, that edgy green mess has always been the most iconic part of this comic to me. Now that I've finally gone back and read it proper, he's a surprisingly small presence, and I do think he definitely blends into the rest of its other big players, but I still like him a lot. The Scourge lockdown arc of Sonic Universe ends on a taunting cliffhanger where the Mad Lad successfully shoves off the Zone Cops to escape interdimensional prison. Once the dust settles, he promises that he has an ambitious revenge scheme already planned. But the reboot hits the world almost immediately after that, so his counterattack is over before it even started. Snively never recovers from the vicious beating Eggman gave him. He's imprisoned in a capsule and left for dead. Like for real, when Dr. Light is also captured during Worlds Collide, you can glimpse Snively in the pod beside him, and at that point, it might genuinely be his corpse. Neither does Shard get to see any repair after Metal Sonic tore right through him. There's a very real chance he wasn't going to make it with his cracked power gem, and we're offered no clarification or comfort before the wave. Like, okay, hear me out on this. Shard is the original Mecha Sonic that had a power gem implanted in him. and he's defeated by the new Metal Sonic who has some other form of power gem in him that I've forgotten about. With that in mind, maybe the way that Shard was going to one-up him was by implanting the ancient Onyx in him. I could see them doing that, and it would have been awesome. Sally sacrifices herself and becomes roboticized. Nicole blames herself and becomes depressed, and spends most of her time hiding away from the rioting citizens out for her head. Antoine falls into a coma after throwing himself on Metal Sonic's kamikaze attempt. And caught in the middle of it, Sonic is doing all he can to not just lash out. Everything rapidly collapses in on itself. Casualties are flung about with reckless abandon, signifying the inevitable end of all things. One that I find especially upsetting is how Knuckles will never find out the fate of his people after Thrash kidnapped everyone he loved and threw them into an unknown pocket dimension. That chapter is so dramatic as you watch Knux battling him through every new zone they warp to. Knuckles is more ferocious than he's ever been, and Thrash is just running scared. Eventually he succeeds in giving him the slip. Knuckles is left with no way of finding his family. It hurts to see, honestly. It's just one last gut punch for the guy that had already endured so many trials. Even though everyone else seems to hate them, I did come to quite like Julie Sue and Dimitri, and thought the Dark Legion was a much needed breather from the oversaturation of the Eggman Empire, while Enerjack and Finidivus should be self-explanatory for how fun they were as villains. This is one of those many positives I was referring to when I talk about how it all goes outward. It's not just Eggman and his army of robots. You get a more fleshed out Eggman Empire, but then there's also the threat of the Legion going out doing their own thing. There's the Battlebird Armada just kinda hanging in the background. You have the Hooligans as mercs for hire, the Babylon Rogues occasionally showing up. Compared to the game series, it puts in a lot of effort to populate the villain side. But as a fan, you just have to watch as their safety is thrown into total question, and there are no answers to be found before they are ultimately annihilated in a reality wipe. Ever since the time skip around issue 130 really, the story had just been focusing on a slow but steady build-up in tension that is then kicked into overdrive when Eggman goes insane in issue 200. The war escalates again and again. Civil unrest runs rampant, and the body count continues to climb. Until that narrative bubble eventually does burst, and the Mad Doctor deprives that entire dimension of any chance at a happy ending. In many regards, I do preach artistic merit in how undeterred the Genesis wave is by any hanging plots, since it makes it feel like a truly global event that affects all pockets of people in an equal way. But that doesn't mean I don't mourn what could have been. With how hard this comic had to work in order to establish the immense quality it eventually reached. How many characters we had been led to love and the cultures they call home. It is genuinely heartbreaking to watch it all fall apart. The heroes have lost. The slate is wiped clean. And a world, a living, breathing world, fades to white.